Welcome to the program. I'm Anne Nwawadu. The Donetsk region prosecutor's office says Russian shelling in Sloviansk has killed 2 people and injured 29 others. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted a video on his social media saying that it shows the aftermath of the attack, showing several burning cars and smoldering debris in what appears to be a residential area. Mr. Zelensky said that Ukraine will not forgive these deaths and wounds, accusing Russia of terrorism. The city authorities say a number of high-rise buildings and offices were damaged or destroyed by the missile strikes at around 10:30 a.m. local time. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin says that Moscow has struck a deal with neighboring Belarus to station tactical nuclear weapons on its territory, but will not violate non-proliferation agreements. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko had long raised the issue of stationing tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, which borders Poland. And this announcement is coming at a time of growing tensions with the West over the Ukraine war, and as some Russian commentators have speculated about a possible nuclear strike.
Что касается наших переговоров с Александром Григорьевичем Лукашенко, с Беларусью.
As for our negotiations with Alexander Grigorovich Lukashenko with Belarus, the pretext was the statement of the British Defense Secretary that they were going to deliver depleted uranium charges to Ukraine. It is still connected with nuclear technologies. It is obvious. However, even out of context of those events and this statement, Alexander Lukashenko has been bringing up the question of deploying Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus for a long time. Listen, we're your closest allies. Why do the Americans deploy the nuclear weapons at their allies on their territory, train the crews, pilots, how to use this type of weapon if needed? We agreed that we will do the same without violating our obligations. I emphasize, without violating our international obligations on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. We have already helped our Belarusian colleagues to modify their aircraft, the aircraft of Belarusian Air Force. 10 aircrafts are ready to use this type of weapon. We have already transferred to Belarus our well-known, very effective missile complex Iskander. It can be a delivery vehicle as well. On April 3, we will start training the crews. On July 1, we will finish the construction of the special repository to store the tactical nuclear weapon in Belarus.
Well, as expected, reactions have been trailing the announcement. The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons has called Mr. Putin's statement an extremely dangerous escalation. It said, quote, "In the context of the war in Ukraine, the likelihood of miscalculation or misinterpretation is extremely high. Sharing nuclear weapons makes the situation much worse and risks catastrophic humanitarian consequences." Also, NATO is calling Russia's nuclear rhetoric dangerous and irresponsible. It says that Russia's reference to NATO's nuclear sharing is totally misleading, referring to Mr. Putin's claims that his move will merely mirror those of Western nations. Lithuania's foreign minister says that it will call for new sanctions against Russia in response to the plans to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Also, the European Union's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, has asked Belarus not to host Russian nuclear weapons, warning that of further sanctions for the Russian ally if it did not allow Russia to deploy its weapons, or if it did allow Russia to deploy its weapons. On the other hand, Ukraine's foreign ministry has called Mr. Putin's statements yet another provocative step that undermines nuclear disarmament efforts and the international security system as a whole, while an advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the statement by Russian President Vladimir Putin shows that he is afraid of losing. However, Germany says that Mr. Putin's announcement is another attempt at nuclear intimidation by Russia. Meanwhile, White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby has said the United States had seen no sign that Russian President Vladimir Putin was preparing to use nuclear weapons. The U.S. is giving a cautious reaction to Russia's plan to sanction tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, saying that it will continue to monitor the implications. Mr. Kirby also weighed in on Russian-Chinese relations following Mr. Xi's visit to Moscow.
I can tell you that we've seen nothing that would indicate Mr. Putin is preparing to use tactical nuclear weapons in any way whatsoever in Ukraine. And I can also tell you that we haven't seen anything that would cause us to change our own strategic nuclear deterrent posture. We don't characterize it as an alliance either. I think, for all the bluster about a no limits relationship, I mean, there clearly are limits to what President Xi has proven he's willing to do in terms of bolstering up Mr. Putin. Now, look, these are two nations that see common cause in pushing back on American leadership around the world and leadership of the West, leadership of NATO. And so they are sort of using one another to chafe and to bristle at American leadership around the world. But it remains to be seen, how much of a true alliance we have here. These are two nations that want to challenge the international rules-based order. In one case, China, they actually have the resources and capabilities to mount an effective challenge. President Putin sees that, he knows that, and that's, we believe, why he's cozying up a little bit more to President Xi.
Belarus's defense ministry released a video showing a training exercise involving an air defense unit armed with Russian-supplied Tor M2K missile launchers. The drill comes after Russian President Vladimir Putin unveiled plans to station Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, claiming that it was in response to an announcement by the United Kingdom that it will hand over ammunition with depleted uranium to the Ukrainian forces. According to Belarusian and Russian defense sources, the system is capable of bringing down a variety of enemy targets, including cruise missiles, glided bombs, drones, and even aircrafts. Joining me now is Ibrahim Anba, who's a fellow at Atlas Network. Thank you very much for joining me virtually from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us on The World today.
Thank you.
What do you make of Russia's plans to station tactical weapons in neighboring Belarus?
Well, I think this is a dangerous move and a desperation as well. Recently Putin met with President Xi of China, and there are all indications that that conversation with Xi didn't really go well. Putin didn't get many things out of that conversation. And if you put that in addition to the fact that, according to reports, Russia has lost close to 200,000 soldiers in its war in Ukraine, plus the fact that Russia's foreign arms export is at a record low, you join all these economic and military factors together, it points to desperation in Putin to resort to this nuclear shakeup. And as you know, Putin definitely is confident in the fact that whenever he mentions the word nuclear, it sends shockwaves across the spines of his enemies.
So you've called this desperation, but is this another nuclear intimidation or maybe blackmail by Russia? What do you think?
I think this is actually serious because you look at the elements involved, uranium charges and this one tactical weapon by Russia. And of course, we have to talk about the Russian on the one side. However, you look at what the UK is going to be sending over to Ukraine. These are uranium charges. The last time uranium was used at a wide scale in this national system was during the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although this is not close to that, but the UK has promised to deliver such uranium packages to Ukraine. And America has similar nuclear bases across Europe. So Putin is just saying, well, America has done it. UK has promised to do it. So why can't I also do it? So although this is a move of desperation from Russia, it also points to the easy way of nuclear proliferation that we've seen as a result of deals like New START being abolished. So it's a desperation on Putin's side, but it also speaks to the proliferation of nuclear arms across the world.
Now, isn't Russia again breaking its arms control commitments? We know, of course, Moscow most recently suspended its participation in the New START treaty.
So, according to the video you played, Russia is pretty much clear that this is not going to break its commitment. But of course, we know that's not going to be the case. And of course, the US have already said this is not going to make it change its nuclear policy. However, it is very serious because you consider the country Belarus. Belarus is just not interested for no reason. It's a strategic location. It immediately borders Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. These are 3 NATO countries. So if you have Putin bringing his nuclear capability into the doorstep of NATO by extending into Belarus, then that means that the nuclear clash is as close as you can ever imagine. So this is not really a bluff, and I think this is making things dangerous, and it's really an appalling fact that Russia pulled out of the New START treaty, which was signed in 2011 with a lot of hopes and aspirations. And of course, it was supposed to expire in 2026. But that deal itself, that treaty, is supposed to keep Russia at bay. Well, without that treaty, it's giving Putin the leeway to do whatever he wants, pretty much, with his nuclear power.
A lot of people, will think the Russian president is trying to play on the intelligence of both Ukraine and its allies by, of course, putting out such statements. Do you think that Mr. Putin's fears, or maybe he's afraid that he's actually losing the war in Ukraine?
I mean, it could be that. We've seen powerful men do that in international relation history. It's called the madman theory. You're trying to make your enemy believe you're going to do anything possible to win, and it's going to make your enemy try to be cautious. In this case, we know that Russia is losing the war heavily, and there is no much options here for Putin to use other than to go for the nuclear option. And of course, as you know, the listeners may already know, this is not bringing nuclear warship or nuclear installation into Belarus per se. The uranium charges that the UK is bringing to Ukraine, and the ones that Russia is bringing to Belarus are not as heavy as a normal nuclear warheads. However, they can cause crazy damage as well. They are even called the smaller evils. So although the ramification may not be as enormous as the traditional nuclear weapons, they are in fact still enormous and a threat to the international system. But this is why I think Putin may not be able to use nuclear weapon in Ukraine because, one, he has his military in Ukraine. You can't nuke your own military when you still have them on ground. And two, if Putin's plan is to eventually take Ukraine and control it, then it's going to have a wasteland to deal with if you go ahead and implement any nuclear policy that will be fatal in that territory.
And talking about policies that will be fatal, I mean, the West has warned the Russian ally Belarus not to allow Russia deploy its weapons. But I mean, do you think that Mr. Putin is trying to use Belarus as a bait here? Aren't there sanctions, or aren't these development sanctions dragging Belarus further into a war with Ukraine, even into a confrontation with the democratic world?
So, as you know, and it's really easy for international superpowers like Russia to use proxies to fight their wars. And we saw that play extensively during the Cold War era. So if Putin can easily use Lukashenko to implement some of his military policies in Europe by not only deploying Russian nuclear weapon into Belarus, but also using Belarusian forces to perhaps fight against Polish or Latvian or potentially Ukrainian forces, then Putin would gladly do that. Because as you've seen, America is not sending its troop into Ukraine, but it's sending its arms, its intelligence into Ukraine. That was proxy wars. So it's going to be so easy for Putin to use Belarus as a stooge. And of course, Lukashenko is so much gladly embracing this. In fact, this talk of tactical nuclear weapon has been going on for a while, and it's much more like Lukashenko is the one asking Putin almost all the time to bring these nuclear tactical weapons to his doorstep, and now it's being actualized. So it shows one thing, that Belarus is willing, at least its leader is willing to become Russia's foot soldier into places like Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, which are NATO countries.
Ibrahim, taking a look at all the issues surrounding this war between Russia and Ukraine, do you think, in your own opinion, the Russian president maybe it's just all about bluffing, or is this another strategy for him?
So as we learned during the Cold War, people can bluff, but bluffing can also bring them to the edge of nuclear Armageddon. I mean, we're very close to nuclear Armageddon during the Cold War. You know the story with the submarine that was most nuclear American submarine, the Russian submarine, almost nuclear American submarine. But the point here is that international super players like Putin, like the US, like the NATO allies, who have nuclear capability, needs to be very cautious in their handling of not only nuclear weapons, but also in their statements as well, because statements can easily provoke enemies. If Russia's plan, let's think, if Putin's plan is to send fake shockwaves, like just to intimidate America and its NATO allies, although America is saying that it's not going to change its own nuclear policy, we know that Pentagon will be moving subvertly and covertly. So bluffing often triggers response in enemies in the international system, and it's so irresponsible for Mr. Putin to resort to this kind of rhetoric. And I mean, I would caution, according to the numerous cautions across the world, I would echo the fact that these leaders need to stop this propaganda and madman attitude, and come to the table to negotiate, because eventually nobody's gonna win the nuclear war if it comes to that, and hopefully not.
So is it safe to say that Mr. Putin or Russia are the villains in this war?
I mean, that's so difficult to say, but see, the point is not to win a war. The point is to settle it, because there is no winning this war, as we've seen. Ukraine can't win it. Russia can't win it. America certainly can't win it. It's asked to end with diplomacy like any other war. And the earlier these people come to the table, people like Xi Jinping, who have access to the Americans in some way, and also have access to Putin, have strong roles to play here. And if Xi Jinping keeps, being very, keep promoting all this attitude of Putin in the international system, it's not going to help anybody. So they need to go back to the negotiating table. Americans need to find a way of having conversation with China. Those frank conversations needs to happen, because at this point, there is no communication channel between Moscow and Washington. And that missing link could be China. We hate the fact that it could be China, but it could be China, in fact. So again, these are all indications that things are volatile. And while things are volatile during the war period, it also means that we also have a chance to pursue peace as a last resort.
All right. Thank you very much, Ibrahim Anba, fellow Atlas Network. Thank you so much for your time on The World Today.
Thanks, Anne.
Welcome back. You're still watching The World Today on Channels Television. The United Nations Human Rights Office says its investigators had confirmed thousands more civilian casualties in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including 21 people have been killed by Russian forces in executions or individual attacks. It found at least 5,987 civilians had been killed or injured between August the 1st, 2022 and January the 31st, 2023. A number, it says, was likely to be a significant underestimate, since it only covered those cases its investigators had been able to verify. Indiscriminate explosive weapons were responsible for a large number of civilian casualties. And that report said that figures showed that at least 4 times more civilian casualties occurred in Ukrainian-held territories than in Russian-held areas.
The war has come at a horrendous human cost. As of this week, we have documented more than 8,000 civilians who have been killed and almost 14,000 injured. More than 90% were caused by missiles, explosive weapons or mines, and explosive remnants of war. The actual figures are unfortunately considerably higher. In occupied areas of Ukraine, we have documented summary executions and attacks on individual civilians by Russian armed forces, and the pervasive use of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances. Since the 24th of February last year, we have documented 621 cases of enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention of civilians by Russian armed forces. Among the 127 that we interviewed after their release, 90% reported that members of the Russian security forces tortured and ill-treated them while in detention, in some cases including with sexual violence. Since the 24th of February 2022, we have documented 91 cases of enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention committed by Ukrainian security forces. Of the 73 victims we interviewed, 53% had been tortured or ill-treated by members of Ukrainian armed forces and law enforcement agencies. We also documented transfers of civilians to areas in occupied territory or to the Russian Federation, some of which may amount to forced transfers or deportations. These transfers include children and adults who lived in social care institutions and unaccompanied children from parts of Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Kiev, and Odessa regions, while they were occupied by the Russian Federation or temporarily controlled by Russian armed forces.
A team of Sweden-based researchers have been using underwater robots to map levels of methane in the Baltic Sea after the leaks from the Nord Stream gas pipelines. Using remote-controlled submersibles called gliders, the group has been building a set of data they hope will help scientists judge the long-term impact that has remained in the water after the leaks last September. The United Nations Environment Programme has said the leaks from the pipelines may have been the highest since single emission of climate-damaging methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent but shorter-lived than carbon dioxide.
Good. It did disconnect a couple of times.
Everyone felt it was very important that we go out there and measure the methane levels and understand what was going on site, because we might want that data in the future to understand possible consequences. So we were lucky to work with these really nice instruments. They're called gliders. They're really good at staying in the water for long periods of time while collecting measurements continuously. So they take a measurement every second and they stay out there for over a month. We reacted very quickly and we went out there really to collect data for whatever purpose might be needed later. Let's say 2 years down the line, we see a decrease in fish populations. We'll want to be able to match that with methane to say, okay, maybe the methane affected reproduction in the fish.
Our studies that we are planning to publish will be one part of a puzzle to eventually map the impact of the methane on the ecosystem of the Baltic Sea. So first we need to answer the question, how much methane did get dissolved in the seawater after the leaks opened? How did it spread with the currents? How did it dilute in the Baltic Sea? And how far did it go and which concentration? So to answer this question, we are setting on the study that basis on observations and modeling at the same time. Concentrations of methane, there were several orders of magnitude higher than natural levels of methane in the seawater. And that could affect the ecosystem in different ways. We don't know that yet, but what we can do is we can provide a map. Where did the methane spread to? In which depth did it go? And in which concentrations did we have this? And we think this is a very important base for future studies when maybe more observations come in. How did the ecosystem respond? What were the observed changes that can base their works upon ours?
In the meantime, the Kremlin says that Russia will establish which state or states that were behind blasts that damaged the Nord Stream gas pipelines and will do everything to stop what it calls Western efforts to cover up what happened. The pipelines, which connect Russia and Germany under the Baltic Sea, were hit by unexplained blasts last September in what Moscow has called the act of international terrorism. President Vladimir Putin had said that he believes the United States was behind the blast, an idea Washington has rejected as false. But earlier, the Russian diplomat said that Moscow may see compensation for the pipeline damage, but did not specify from whom. Orlando Bloom, a goodwill ambassador for the United Nations Children's Organization UNICEF and a star of the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Lord of the Rings movies, has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv. Bloom showered Zelensky with praises before reaching across the table and then pounding Zelensky's chest while telling an amused Ukrainian leader who has a heart. It was the first trip to Ukraine since 2016. Meanwhile, Orlando also visited a children's center in Kyiv. The British actor said, "I would never have expected the war to have escalated throughout the country since I was there. But today, I was fortunate to hear children laugh at the UNICEF-supported Spleno Center, a safe, warm and nurturing space for children to play, learn and receive psychological support." The Spleno Center, spread throughout Ukraine, offers support for displaced children and their families, with more than 500,000 children and their caregivers having visited one in the past year. According to Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office, as of March 26th, at least 465 children have been killed in a 13-month-long war Russia waged against its neighbor, Ukraine.